Melody was suddenly pulled back into a situation she thought was behind her, something that could now affect her life in a real way. In that moment, it became clear that she wasn't fully prepared for what was coming, not because she had done anything wrong, but because it happened so suddenly, and situations like that can shake anyone. To understand why this moment hit so hard, it's important to go back and see how the tension between Melody Shari and Wanda Scott built up over time instead of happening overnight. Melody first came into the spotlight as someone strong, outspoken, and easy for viewers to connect with on Love and Marriage, Huntsville, where people watched her go through deeply personal struggles, including her marriage falling apart, trust issues, and emotional challenges played out publicly. Despite all of that, she kept pushing forward, rebuilding her life, focusing on her children, starting businesses, and working hard to create stability after chaos. However, not everyone supported her growth. Wanda Scott often questioned Melody's image and actions, and while some saw it as protection of her own family, others felt there was deeper personal tension behind her words. Over time, Wanda's comments became more frequent and sharper, turning what once looked like opinion into a clear pattern of criticism that continued as Melody tried to move forward. Still, nobody expected things to escalate to a courtroom. When Wanda showed up with documents, everything shifted completely. She presented herself with confidence, claiming she had evidence that revealed hidden truths and suggesting there were details people hadn't seen before. Instead of revealing everything at once, she slowly built tension, which made the situation even more intense and kept everyone watching closely. Outside the courtroom, the situation quickly spread online, with clips going viral and people dividing into different opinions. Some continued supporting Melody while others demanded answers. Wanda remained firm in her claims, insisting she was telling the truth, but as people began reviewing the details more closely, inconsistencies started appearing. Certain dates didn't match, some documents looked questionable, and even casual viewers began to feel that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Melody chose a very different approach. She stayed calm instead of reacting emotionally. That calmness changed how people viewed the situation, as she avoided chaos and focused on control. Reports suggested she began gathering her own verified records quietly, not to create drama, but to protect herself properly and respond with facts rather than emotion. As the situation developed, doubts around Wanda's claims grew stronger, and one inconsistency led to another until the story started losing stability. People who had initially believed the accusations began stepping back and questioning what they had seen. Wanda tried to defend and adjust her statements, offering explanations and clarifications, but by that point, the narrative had already started shifting. Attention slowly turned away from Melody being accused and moved toward the credibility of Wanda's claims instead. What first looked like a strong exposure moment started appearing less certain and more questionable as time went on. Through all of this, it became clear that the situation was no longer just entertainment drama, it had real consequences. For Melody, it was about protecting her name, her work, and her family, and even though she remained composed publicly, the pressure behind the scenes was still real. Her family could feel the emotional weight of everything happening, even if they weren't directly involved. What stood out most, however, was her growth in how she handled it. Instead of reacting with chaos like before, she stayed patient, controlled, and focused, showing a different level of strength. Still, the situation remains unresolved because cases like this don't simply disappear. They either get cleared up or continue to escalate. Now the big questions remain: what happens next, whether more evidence will surface, whether legal action will follow, or whether Melody will choose to step back and protect her peace. And for Wanda, the question is whether this was a firm belief she stood by or a move that went further than expected. In the end, one thing is clear: moments like this reveal everything, and not all battles are loud. Some are decided quietly, through patience and truth. As the situation continued to unfold, the pressure around both women kept building, and what once looked like a simple accusation started turning into something much more complicated. People around the situation began pulling back, choosing their words more carefully, because it was no longer just about opinions, it was about possible legal consequences, reputations, and what could actually be proven. Melody remained mostly silent in public, but that silence was strategic. Instead of feeding the noise, she allowed things to play out while focusing on facts and preparation behind the scenes. Those close to her suggested she was no longer reacting emotionally to anything being said, but instead building a clear, structured response that could stand on its own if things moved further legally. At the same time, Wanda's position became more difficult to maintain as scrutiny increased. The more people examined what had been presented, the more questions surfaced. What initially sounded like certainty began to feel less stable under closer review, and that shift changed how the public engaged with the situation. Some who had strongly supported Wanda began to reconsider, not necessarily because they had taken sides too quickly, but because the details weren't holding up as clearly as expected. That shift in perception slowly changed the energy around the entire situation, turning what once felt like an exposure moment into something uncertain and unresolved. Behind the scenes, tensions reportedly remained high, but communication between the two sides appeared limited or non-existent, with everything now moving through formal channels rather than personal exchanges. That alone signaled how serious things had become, because once personal conflict turns into structured legal or documented processes, the tone changes completely. It's no longer about emotions or public statements. It becomes about evidence, timing, and credibility. For Melody, this moment also became a reflection point. After everything she had already been through publicly, this situation reinforced how quickly narratives can shift and how easily public perception can be influenced before all facts are clear. Instead of rushing to respond or engage in back-and-forth exchanges, she appeared more focused on long-term protection of her reputation, her children's peace, and her future stability. That approach, while quieter, carried a different kind of strength, one rooted in restraint rather than reaction. Meanwhile, the audience watching from the outside remained divided, with ongoing debates, speculation, and constant updates circulating online. But even with all the noise, one thing became more obvious over time. The truth in situations like this doesn't usually come out through the loudest voices, but through what can actually be verified and sustained under pressure. And as the dust slowly begins to settle, the situation stands at an uncertain point. Nothing has fully ended, but the initial shock has faded, replaced by questions that still need answers. Whether this leads to a final resolution, a quiet dismissal, or a deeper legal battle, one thing is clear: both reputations have already been affected in some way, and the final outcome will depend not on speculation, but on what can ultimately be proven. As the situation moved forward, it became clear that both sides were now operating in a much more careful and controlled environment. Every statement, every public comment, and every reaction carried more weight than before, because nothing could be taken lightly anymore. What started as a wave of accusations and responses had now settled into a slower, more cautious phase where strategy mattered more than emotion. For Melody, this stage meant staying consistent and disciplined. Instead of engaging with every claim or reacting to every update, she focused on letting facts speak for themselves. The shift in her approach showed experience and restraint, especially in a situation where public pressure could easily push someone into making rushed decisions. By staying grounded, she avoided adding more fuel to an already sensitive situation, which in turn helped her maintain control over her narrative. On the other side, Wanda's situation continued to face growing scrutiny as outside voices became more critical and analytical. What once spread quickly as shocking claims was now being slowed down by questions and verification attempts. In environments like this, attention can shift just as fast as it builds, and that's exactly what began happening. The same audience that once reacted immediately was now pausing, rechecking details, and waiting for clearer answers before forming final opinions. As time passed, the intensity of the moment didn't completely disappear, but it did transform. The loud reactions quieted down, replaced by uncertainty and observation. People were no longer just reacting emotionally, they were looking for clarity, context, and confirmation. And in situations involving reputation and legal implications, that shift often changes everything. Behind closed doors, both sides were now reportedly focused on preparation rather than confrontation. That meant organizing information, reviewing records, and making sure every detail could stand up if it needed to. It also meant fewer public exchanges and more structured handling of the matter, which is often where real resolution begins to take shape, even if the public doesn't see it right away. For those watching from the outside, the story had entered a waiting phase. The initial shock value had faded, but interest remained strong because unanswered questions still lingered. People wanted clarity, not speculation, and that meant the situation could not fully settle until something concrete emerged. In the bigger picture, this entire chain of events highlighted how quickly public perception can shift and how fragile reputations can become when conflict moves into public and legal spaces. It also showed the importance of patience in situations where facts are still unfolding, because early assumptions don't always reflect the final outcome. Now, everything rests in a space of uncertainty. There are no final conclusions yet, only ongoing developments and unresolved questions. Whether the next step brings closure, continuation, or a complete shift in direction will depend entirely on what evidence holds up and what truth eventually comes forward. Until then, the situation remains open, watched closely by those waiting to see how it ultimately resolves. As things continued to unfold, the silence from both sides became even more noticeable. What once was a loud, fast-moving situation full of claims, reactions, and online debate had now slowed into something more restrained and uncertain. Instead of constant updates and public back and forth, there was now distance, careful distance, between what was being said publicly and what was actually happening behind the scenes. For Melody, this phase meant even more focus on protection and stability. The situation had already shown her how quickly things can shift in the public eye, so her priority became making sure she stayed grounded and fully prepared for whatever direction things took next. Rather than getting pulled into speculation, she continued relying on documented information and structured communication, making sure nothing she did added unnecessary attention or confusion. That kind of approach also helped reduce emotional pressure, allowing her to stay focused on her personal life and responsibilities while the situation played out externally. Meanwhile, Wanda's position remained under observation as people continued trying to make sense of the claims that had started everything. With time, the conversation around her became less about immediate reaction and more about credibility and consistency. When situations reach this stage, attention naturally shifts from shock to evaluation, and that's exactly what began happening. Every detail that had once been accepted quickly was now being rechecked more carefully, and that change in public behavior created a very different atmosphere around the entire situation. As both sides stayed largely quiet in public, the absence of new developments created a kind of pause that left room for interpretation, speculation, and continued discussion. Some people believed more clarity would eventually come through official channels, while others felt the situation might slowly fade without a dramatic conclusion. Either way, the uncertainty kept interest alive, even if the intensity had lowered. Behind the scenes, the focus appeared to remain on preparation rather than confrontation. That meant reviewing information carefully, organizing any relevant records, and ensuring that everything being considered could hold up under scrutiny if needed later. In situations like this, what happens privately often matters more than what is seen publicly, because that is where outcomes are usually shaped long before anything is officially resolved. For the audience watching from the outside, the story had shifted into a long waiting period. The initial explosion of attention had passed, but curiosity had not. Instead, it had transformed into a slower, more cautious interest, one that depends on facts rather than emotion. People were no longer reacting instantly. They were waiting, analyzing, and looking for something concrete that could finally bring clarity. In the broader sense, the entire situation became a reminder of how quickly public narratives can form and how slowly they are sometimes corrected. It also highlighted how important timing, evidence, and patience become when reputations are involved and claims are made in highly visible spaces. What may begin as a loud moment can often turn into a quiet process of verification and resolution